Yeah, we're going to go into the 11th law of power today, and that is learning how to keep people dependent on you. Why that can be good is when you have a wit that is strong enough to provide for others, give them happiness, prosperity, fulfillment in their life. When you can do that, you're going to gain freedom yourself, and you're going to have that freedom because people are going to always want you. They're going to practically need you, and that's when they're dependent on you. We'll go over, there's a couple instances where this does not work, so we'll run through that first. Here's sort of an extreme example. Way back when, hundreds of years ago, Siena was a town that was saved by a mercenary soldier, and the town's people no longer sat in fear of their enemies. Prior to this mercenary soldier and how he saved the town, they were in fear of their enemies, and they were so gracious for their hero that they decided to make him a patron saint, which meant they killed him. They killed him and honored him as a patron saint, and they were dependent on the guy for their safety, which is pretty wild, but people used to be extreme like that. We'll go into a more understandable one. Back in 1442, you had what was called a condottieri, and the one in Venice was known as the Count of Carmagnola, and he believed that his citizens revered him so much that he thought he was untouchable. And one day he was actually invited to go dine at the Doge's palace. That's what I guess they used to call their kings in Venice, a Doge. After arriving at the palace, this count was led to the dungeons, and he was led to the dungeons because he was persecuted on some trumped up charges. And all the people that he thought admired him, they were shocked and horrified because they couldn't believe these charges that the count received. And he was eventually beheaded, and the citizens just could not understand what that meant for them. And when you really look at it, condottieri of the Renaissance, so pretty much, the guy every man wanted to be, a Renaissance man, really, they were banished after so many accomplishments for their employers. Sort of like what you see today. Sometimes really accomplished people, they get fired after doing something amazing for a company, because they just become too replaceable. They were pretty much cookie cutters, and they couldn't really stay on edge. They couldn't have their edge. It eventually wore down. And that's when, like the Count of Carmagnola, that count would just take his power for granted, and that's when he was dispensed. That's what happens when you don't make people dependent on you. You become dispensable. So what we want to look at are these examples where people were indispensable and how they kept people dependent on them. We'll look back to Prussia in 1847. Otto von Bismarck he was a deputy, and he didn't really have an ally or any friends that sort of helped him out. He had to do everything on his own. So this Bismarck guy chose to stand behind King Frederick William IV, and he chose this guy because he knew him to be a little bit weaker, and he knew that he could maybe be an asset to this guy. So he'd, make him dependent. Otto von Bismarck would make this King Fred William dependent on him, because he didn't have the resources that he should have had. And he was criticized often. That king was criticized, looked at as spineless. But when it was 1851, Bismarck was made a minister for helping this Fred William out so much. He was made a minister in the king's cabinet. And this is when Otto von Bismarck began to play his cards by frequently forcing the king's hand. So his moves eventually allowed power to be restored to King Frederick William IV, which he wouldn't have had without Otto von Bismarck. And, Bismarck pretty much was like, listen, you have to stop listening to every single demand that people are asking you of, because you don't have to give people everything. And that's why King Fred William was spreading himself too thin, wearing himself out, and Bismarck stopped this, which almost made Bismarck indispensable. So when King Frederick died in 1861, his brother took the throne. And King Frederick's brother, he did not like Bismarck at all. They would get in little arguments, quarrels, spats, but eventually, Bismarck's strong-arm tactics were too good. The Prussian parliament needed him, and soon Otto von Bismarck guy became Prime Minister of Prussia. And it all started by taking a step back and figuring out who he should partner with. So there's some other laws that we've went over before. So eventually Bismarck unified the German states. Looking at a whole interpretation of all that whole example, essentially Bismarck chose to friend weaker leaders in order to foster a relationship of dependency, so he couldn't be thrown away. He created a need for himself that was almost indestructible, and then he was able to rise from just a deputy to being prime minister. There's a couple keys to power we could just run through with this. If you want to get people to do as you wish, you do not want to be forcing or hurting them. You want to make people dependent on you and mesh your work with theirs. So make sure they need you in some form. Power is not independence. This is where a lot of people get it wrong. Power is an interpersonal relationship dynamic. It's not being able to do nothing. 4, you're going to want to have an irreplaceable talent or skill to keep people dependent on you. So you want to be really good at something that you can make a part of someone else's process. That's how business works. 5, you want to work on intertwining fates like a marketer that a small company relies on. So if someone has this marketing skill that a small company relies on to stay in business, they're sort of going to be, their success is intertwined. And if you've made it, really, if the removal of your presence causes chaos, if a group of people can't go a day without you, that's when you have created some profitable connections there. Also, a big one, keep hope alive, but never be satisfied. So make sure people need you. Anyways, a reversal of this by making others depend on you. So just when you might not want people to depend on you, by making other people depend on you, that makes you dependent on them as well, just not to as strong of a degree. Fostering independence leads to an unbearable pressure to be on top. Like, if you have, if you truly want to just never talk to anyone and sort of isolate yourself, you're more of a character that's going to want to monopolize in business. Independence often proves fatal by stirring up resentment both inside and outside of companies. The king doesn't always have that much power if he's shackled up in his castle all day. And that's just law 11, learning to keep people dependent on you, really. You want to be able to provide a quality product or service for someone, and then mesh your talents with someone else's, so that'll keep a good relationship going. But anyways, have a great day.